The topic today is the nutrition transition and global food issues. And when you talk about how food affects people, enters the body, has an impact on health, on economies and things like that, things get really interesting when you take a global point of view. The global politics affect food, as you heard when we talked about hunger. Global economics affects the availability of food and the prices around the world. And at one point, food was so local that what happened to the food world in one part of the world didn't really affect very much what happened elsewhere in the world. But those days are gone. And now things like American subsidies to the corn farmers have enormous impact on what's happening worldwide. We'll talk more about that in the economics lecture. But today, we're going to talk about what the picture looks like around the world and how diets have changed in countries outside the US and what are some of the driving factors that have made this happen. So today we're going to talk about how there are changes in the global disease burden. And as I've alluded to in earlier classes, the nature of diseases that cultures are exposed to and countries must confront because of the impact of disease on the economy, on healthcare costs, on productivity, on the size of the workforce when you have major diseases killing a lot of people. You see how important these are, and the global burden, the global distribution of diseases have changed. We're going to talk about changes in diet and obesity in particular, and then I'd like to give you 4 case studies. We'll talk about China, India, South Africa, and Finland, all different from each other in some ways, but all affected by the same world market forces. So it'll be interesting to go through this. So certainly world health is in transition. The non-communicable diseases, NCD, are now overriding the communicable diseases. And in some countries, there's a double burden where both occur in very large numbers. Now, as I've mentioned before, communicable diseases would be traditional infectious diseases where people get a specific disease from an agent in the environment. The non-communicable diseases are ones that people don't catch from something in the environment or from another person, but diseases that are caused mainly by lifestyle, which can also be toxic, as I've described before. The diets are changing around the world, but not only are diets changing, physical activity patterns are changing. This in turn affects diet, it certainly affects body weight. The aging of the population, especially in certain countries of the world, is changing the healthcare picture. And globalization is having a massive impact. And as we'll talk about later in the class, if you take something like food marketing, there was once a time when if a country had the will to do something about food marketing, it could control what was going on within its borders because there wasn't much marketing leaking in from the outside or overwhelming what a country might be doing on its own. But those times are different. With the internet, satellite television, etc., the ability of a country to even control what's going on the airwaves or over the computer is very limited. Some people may say that's a good thing, say in countries that don't have much freedom, that the leakage from the internet from the outside actually helps inform people and is a good thing overall. But there may be some negative consequences in terms of food marketing and things like that. So the global picture is changing, to be sure. Now, some of the changes are pretty obvious and we've discussed or alluded to before. But the world is changing from local eating to global eating. And that change has had profound impacts. So as I said before, the relationship people used to have with food was that they were close to where it was grown. They might know the person who grew it. If not, they knew the person who bought it from the person who grew it, and then they prepared it and they and their families ate it. And there weren't many steps between the origination of the food and the metabolism of the food. But now many steps lie in between, and more people in the world are dependent on food from outside their local area. This is affected by national and international policies to some extent. We'll give you some examples of that today. But the local traditions have yielded to families eating out, eating large amounts of food, and subsisting on an abundance of food when it's available, usually at low cost. And this has by now, pretty predictable consequences. The markets have changed. Where people buy foods has changed a lot around the world. So in many parts of the world, you still see the kind of pictures that are on the left, but more and more you're seeing the pictures on the right. Now, it's a very interesting issue about whether having access to what you see on the right is a good thing. We will talk in this class about how in the United States, poor people tend not to have access to what you see on the right, nor to what you see on the left. But what they have access to are small markets in inner city neighborhoods that charge high prices for low quality food. That access becomes a problem, and so bringing in something like you see on the right becomes an asset. In the developing world, it appears, from what little we know about this so far, the picture may be different. That large markets that have many choices of processed, packaged, and in many cases imported foods tend to undermine local food traditions, get people away from eating what they might have been eating naturally, and give them access to a wide variety of foods that are less desirable than what they were eating before because they're more nutrient poor and more calorie dense. So there are differences depending on where you live in the world. The issue of choice is interesting. And as I mentioned before in class, very often when people come to the United States, in fact, one of our students in the videotape mentioned this before, they're amazed by the number of choices and by the size of things that they're exposed to. But people come to the US and they see 100 different salad dressings in a supermarket, 50 different yogurts, cereals that would fill up a whole aisle with dozens and dozens of choices. And when people come and are confronted by this, it's interesting to see how they respond. Very often people from other countries say, well, why do you need that many choices? I mean, what's wrong with 5 salad dressings? And what's wrong with 6 yogurts? And what's wrong with 10 cereals? But we have so many that we have this flood of choice that Americans believe is a good thing because the word choice gets connected conceptually with freedom and all that sort of thing, that the idea of restricting choice becomes pretty taboo in our country. But in fact, there are some researchers who have studied this issue of choice. And very often people confronted by choices where they have too many choices don't function well psychologically. And it becomes more difficult to make good decisions in the face of a vast array of choices when a small number of choices would have done. And so this paradox of choice confronts Americans because we have so many choices, but it's beginning to happen elsewhere in the world, and people around the world are now facing this sort of paradox of choice where at first glance it seems like a good thing, but in fact may not be, especially when it erodes local customs. Transportation is changing a lot, and this is changing the physical activity picture. So getting around like this is yield to getting around like this. And the number of people in the world who are now moving by motorized transport, even in countries like China, has gone way up. And this has had a major effect on physical inactivity. Here's an example of this again. So if you look at China, on the left you see pictures of everybody on a bicycle for the most part, and on the right, vast numbers of people in cars, but even more so on motor scooters. And there's some research done in China showing that when families secure a motor scooter, which is more and more possible because of the increasing wealth in the country, the likelihood of people being overweight in the family goes up, even people that are not the primary users of the scooter. So these things tend to have these cascading effects that are very interesting. Now let's talk about physical activity in our own lives, and you can see how this is going into the modern environment. I mean, my guess is that very few of you have ever even been inside an automobile where you have to crank the window with something like this. Mainly everything's done with an electronic button. There used to be a time when to tune the radio, you actually had to turn a knob rather than just press a button. And of course, think of the remote control that saves you many, many, many trips a year from a chair to a television to change the station. And each of those in their own right may not add up to a lot, but if you take the cumulative effect of all those type of things, and those are just examples, you have an enormous amount of energy people used to spend in day-to-day life that they're now not. Add to that the fact that many jobs now are not physically demanding. because of the use of technologies and computers and robots in manufacturing and on and on and on, you see that the population physical activity has declined a lot in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So in the United States, it used to be the case that you were paid to exercise. It was called your job. And now people pay to exercise in several ways. You join a club, you buy exercise equipment, but you pay an opportunity cost because of the crazed lifestyle everybody lives. If you take time to be physically active, it's time that you could otherwise be doing other things. You could do other leisure things, you could rest, you could spend time with your family, you could get more work done. There are a lot of different things that compete with exercise. So the fact that it used to be crammed into your day-to-day life by necessity is no longer the case so much, and this is happening around the world. So the number of people in countries like China who have a television, who have motorized transport, has increased a lot, and this is combining with the changing food environment to create great risk. So if we look at things that really, the lifestyle factors that drive the non-communicable diseases, the three big ones are smoking, obesity, and physical inactivity, and then diet would fall under the obesity thing. And then in the developing world, you're basically seeing these changes happen, and then we can't be surprised that diseases fall from this. So these are big problems around the world. We're not talking about tobacco in this particular class, but boy, if we did, would there be a story to tell. Vast numbers of people smoking in the developing world, just like they are eating a bad diet, being physically inactive, and getting the same diseases that have plagued the United States, and that's happening around the world as well. We'll also talk about food industry behavior, because a lot of the growth of some of the American food companies, especially the fast food restaurants, are occurring outside the US. It's not as if the US market is completely saturated, because there's always more space to cram in fast food restaurants. But we're probably approaching saturation, and each of the companies is having trouble building a lot because they're competing with all the other fast food restaurants. But that's not true overseas, and so a lot of the growth in some of these companies is outside the US border, as exactly happened with the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry got hammered by lawsuits and by government regulations and bad publicity in the United States. They took their business overseas and have made enormous amounts of money imperiling the health of people outside the US borders. The food industry has been accused by some people of doing similar things. So let's look at the changing burden of disease across the world. If you look at how disease is spread, the diseases are spread across different parts of the world, and this graph will be a little hard to see because it's not that big, but you can see it when you pull it up on the web, that the red represents high mortality developing countries. Low mortality developing countries are the white, and then the medium blue are developed countries. And at the top of the list you see up there, the total burden is, oh that's yellow in the middle, is blood pressure. Now high blood pressure, and we'll come back to some recent data on this, is contributing to lots of different diseases and seems to be the number one factor that one might intervene, second with tobacco following close behind, that you could do something about to lower the number of deaths worldwide. And these various things are spread across different countries or different parts of the SES spectrum with countries, socioeconomic class spectrum across different countries in interesting ways. But if you look at all the things here, the top things, blood pressure, tobacco, cholesterol, underweight, unsafe sex, fruit and vegetable intake, high body mass index, physical inactivity, alcohol, all those things are driven by lifestyle. Now the hunger less so, because that can be a problem with food access. But the rest of the things are driven by choices people make in their lives, and those in turn are affected by government policy and a variety of broad and powerful factors. So it certainly makes sense, if we want to make the world healthier, to think about these chronic diseases and about the diseases that are driven by lifestyle. And in the case of our class, we're talking about this with diet. Here's a very interesting graphic that depicts this changing global burden of disease. This is a chart that shows the leading causes of death in rural China. Total population 813 million people. Very large numbers of people. And I'm going to show you this graphic that has little people figures, and each figure represents a certain number of deaths. Doesn't matter so much exactly how many deaths, but you'll just see the relative number of little people figures show up here. So first we'll take communicable diseases. Again, the sort of things that you thought would kill people in a country like China, only 2.6% of the deaths. Next are injuries, which are multiples of the communicable diseases. So 11% of the people who die in China die from injuries, in rural China that is. But if you look at the non-communicable diseases, the chronic diseases produced by lifestyle, here's how the chart looks. I mean, an absolutely amazing difference. And one would have never thought this was possible in a country like China, but it certainly is. So this leads down some interesting roads about what we might do in these various countries. A paper that came out quite recently talked about blood pressure. I would like to loop back to that. And made the case that 80% of high blood pressure is occurring in the developing world. Now, of course, if you calculate, if you take into account that China and India, with their very large populations, would be included in this, this number, you can see why you get a large percentage occurring outside countries like the US, just because the populations are not in balance. But still, this shows where the world health burden is occurring and what's driving it. This particular study used the Global Burden of Diseases study that's done by the WHO, the World Health Organization, in Geneva. So what they did was these investigators looked at the number of deaths from stroke and the number of deaths from hypertensive diseases and compared high-income countries with low and middle-income countries. And here are the number of deaths from stroke, quite a difference between those different types of countries. And then the number of deaths from hypertensive disease look like this. So again, orders of magnitude difference. So these countries do have to worry about these diseases. They're happening in very large numbers, and they are a huge burden to the healthcare systems in these countries. And I'll play you a couple of audio tape clips that get at this. So it's a very interesting issue, something where some kind of action definitely needs to be taken. So that's the downside. The upside is that there are opportunities, that if these countries see it coming, if they say, well, let's look to our developed country brethren and see what they've done and what's happened to them, and we don't want to get that way, what can we do about it? They may have an opportunity to get involved before business interests take over, before the economic drivers of this are just so profound that the countries can't turn it around. And even then it may be difficult, because global factors are occurring that are helping drive this. But they at least have the opportunity. And thankfully, some of the countries are beginning to think about this. Countries like Thailand and Brazil have a great deal of concern about growing obesity rates, poor diet deteriorating, physical inactivity, and they want to do something about it. So maybe this early attention in some of the countries will create opportunities for doing some good things. In this context, the term nutrition transition becomes important, and this has been defined by the people who study it as population shifts in diet that contribute to increased risk of obesity and chronic diseases such as diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. This transition, if you read the papers by the people who have really developed the term, has several phases, and various countries in the world are in different phases here. The person who is most well known for using this term and has probably done more work on it than anybody else is Barry Popkin, who's at the University of North Carolina and a well-known figure in public health. And one of the papers that were in your reading, the one that's referenced down here, deals with this nutrition transition. But he's been talking about this for many years, and he's collaborated with researchers in China and Brazil and other countries to really find out what's happening in these countries and to identify the factors that are driving the profound dietary change in various parts of the world. So Popkin's quite a good researcher. If you Google him, if you're interested in exploring this more, you'll pull up his website at the University of North Carolina, and his institute or center there has a variety of resources that you can look at on the nutrition transition and related problems. People have talked about the dual burden that the nutrition transition has helped create, and the dual burden is when undernutrition and overnutrition exist in the same country, or in a smaller unit of a country like the same city, the same town, or as we mentioned before, even the same family. So in some countries, as many as 60% of the households suffer from this dual burden, where you have undernutrition and overnutrition going on in the same family. And the most often cited case of this, but it's not the only one, is where you have an obese mother and an undernourished child. So it shows how, in some ways, sick the food relationship is around the world when you see this kind of thing happening. And so when you add together the undernutrition in the world, which is a major problem, and the overnutrition, and then layer on top of that the fact that somebody may not be particularly overnourished or undernourished, but they're just not eating a healthy array of foods, then a great deal of the world is affected by this. So changing the world's relationship to food and changing the foods that people have access to and they wish to eat can make a big difference in the well-being of the world. This slide will show overweight and underweight prevalence in 36 developing countries and break it down by urban women and rural women. So when I pull up this graph, you're gonna see lots of bars and data, and it'll be hard to decipher all at once, but I'm gonna bring your attention to one particular part of it. So the urban women will be on the left, the rural women on the right, and this is done country by country. So you can look to see how big of a problem undernutrition is and overnutrition is within a given country, and then you can look to see whether there are differences between urban and rural. And given that we're going to use India as one of the case examples here, I've circled the data for India that you see in the red. So if you look at the bars circled by the red on the left, you have undernutrition on the left, that bar, and then overnutrition on the right, the darker bar. And the numbers aren't too different. So in urban women, you have a lot of undernutrition. You also have a lot of overnutrition, but the numbers seem about the same. If you go to the rural women on the right, the differences are really they're really quite striking differences, where there are large numbers of people suffering from undernutrition, relatively small numbers suffering from overnutrition. This has implications for the urbanization of countries like India. And the fact that people in many of these developing countries are fleeing from the countryside into the urban areas changes the risk profile that they suffer and changes whether overweight and underweight is the predominant problem. And there will be some sense of that in an audio clip I'll show you. You can look at the countries in the UK and look at the percentage of children who are overweight in these countries. And so each number shows the percentage of the percentage of children who are overweight. And it varies a lot from country to country, as low as, let's say, 12% in some countries, and then you get down to Italy and you get 36%. You've got some very large differences, but pretty high numbers overall. And so it was once thought that obesity was a pretty peculiarly American problem, but obviously not the case. So this is a pretty dispiriting number. Another graph breaks it down by type of countries and where they are in the world. So this would be the number of children, in this case, who are overweight or obese by region. And the total height of the bar shows the combination of these two. So the Americas by far have the largest number. Europe is catching up, and then you have smaller numbers in other parts of the world. The question is, will those other countries in the world ever catch up to the United States? And if they do, what kind of consequences will this have for them? Here are trends showing the prevalence of overweight children from 1987 to 1997 in a variety of countries. So in each case, you're seeing increases. In some cases, you're seeing quite significant increases. Mexico is now the second most obese country in the world after the US. So they're suffering from a lot of these kind of problems. So these trends don't look very good. Clearly the world's having trouble with its eating and with its diseases that follow from it, and the trends don't look very good. They don't look good in the US, they don't look good elsewhere in the world, and we've got a big problem on our hands. So it becomes very interesting to ask, what do we do about it? If we take obesity as one of the diet-related diseases and ask where it's increasing the most, you get a chart that looks like this. So on the left two bars are the males and females in the US, and these are data showing the prevalence of obesity. And then we'll block out other parts of it. So you see Morocco entered into the bottom there. We'll take Brazil, so the numbers are starting to get pretty high. China, now this is the increase in rates of obesity. You have Thailand here, and then you have Mexico here. So the prevalence is increasing in the US, but it's increasing much more as a percentage of the population in some of the other countries. So there are places in the world that face significant issues with this. So I mentioned we were going to do 4 case studies, so let's start that out. We're going to talk about China, India, South Africa, and Finland. Obviously different parts of the world facing many different circumstances from one another, but in some ways converging on a common theme that is pretty representative of what's happening around the world. And in these cases, significant issues are happening. Now, one of the students in the class was kind enough just the other day to send me a copy of a photo she took when she was in southern China, showing the KFC lighted on the street at night. KFC is the second most widely recognized corporate logo in China now, outside of Chinese companies. So it's a very big presence in that country, 1,700 outlets and growing at the moment. And so in China, using that as an example, we have pretty important changes occurring. And something that one would have never guessed would ever happen now is. And so there are now treatment clinics in Beijing for obese children. The health authorities are concerned about this greatly. The schools are starting to deal with it. So it has become a real problem in the country. The rate of obesity has doubled in China in 10 years. There was a particular study that surveyed 270,000 adults in that country. They estimated that there were 60 million obese people, 200 million overweight in that country, 20 million people with diabetes, vast numbers of people with a disease that has terrible consequences for the people who suffer from it, especially if the health care is inadequate. 160 million have high blood pressure, and you saw from the previous chart what that can do, and then vast numbers of people are smoking as well. Now I'm tempted to start talking about the tobacco picture in these countries because it's so appalling, but that's a little bit off task. Okay, so let's talk about obesity and cardiovascular disease in the Asia-Pacific region. There are strong associations between body mass index and stroke, as well as heart disease in countries spread across that part of the world. Now the interesting part of this, and I may have mentioned this before, but there are certain ethnic groups that seem to be especially vulnerable to metabolic and disease consequences of increasing weight. And so far, the research suggests that people of Asian descent have the greatest vulnerability to increases in weight. So let's say you take Caucasian people in the US or other developed countries, and they gain a certain amount of weight. Let's call that X. And then at that point, the disease risk really kicks in. And they start getting increased risk for heart disease, stroke, hypertension, all the other problems. In people of Asian descent, that same degree of risk kicks in at a lower number. Let's just say 75% of X, or 65% of X, or 80% of X. So a much smaller degree of weight gain is producing the same health ramifications that people in other cultures have experienced. So that makes intervention or prevention in particular parts of the world an especially pressing issue. And it's why the expected rates of diabetes are just astronomical in some parts of the world. And that statistic that you see in the bottom bullet point, that the mean age of strokes and heart attacks were 10 years younger in China than Australia. It gives some sense of that particular biological vulnerability. Using India as a case study, we get a very interesting picture. And we have to ask ourselves questions like from that chart I showed before, why do hunger and obesity coexist? Why does it differ from urban to rural areas? What can we learn from this about agriculture and food supply around the world? Now, I showed you this slide before when we were discussing hunger in India. And in this case, the darker colors represent the parts of the country where they have the most significant rates of hunger. Now, in the rural areas of this part of India, you'll have less obesity, but in the urban areas, you'll have more, and these problems tend to coexist. Now, I'd like to play you a clip from National Public Radio on this, because I think it's very telling and interviews some people in India about this particular issue.
Support for NPR comes from BT, who believes that we can achieve energy security by investing in a diverse portfolio of energy sources. More at bp.com/US.
Sorry, I couldn't get around that.
India's population is growing, and not just numerically. The people there are actually getting bigger. India does have more hungry people than anywhere else in the world, but obesity is rising so fast that some doctors call it an epidemic. India's health minister has warned that unless the issue is addressed with the utmost urgency, the cost to the country could be enormous. Mandy Cunningham reports from New Delhi.
Gaurav Joshi is a newly qualified software engineer. He's on the threshold of what he hopes will be a happy and lucrative career. But he has a problem that can undermine everything, even before his working life begins.
Firstly, I am overweight. I'm very much overweight. So I want to get rid of that because I'm facing a lot of problems because of obesity. At the age of 23, I have a high blood pressure problem. That's not good. And I have a family history of diabetes also. I don't want to get into all those things.
Gaurav is one of millions of middle-class Indians suffering from obesity. He says he needs to lose 40 pounds. That's why every day he comes here to one of a crop of new health clinics that have sprung up in New Delhi, specifically to address the problems of the new consumer age, such as stress and obesity. The clinic's run by Dr. Shikha Sharma. She says that in large cities, 30% of adolescents are obese, an issue which needs to be taken seriously.
We were a country of people who had tropical diseases and undernourished. And from being undernourished, we, instead of becoming healthy, we are becoming malnourished, that is, bad nourished.
Unlike in the United States, obesity in India is mainly a problem for the urban middle class. People who can afford to patronise shopping malls like this one, where you can buy takeaway pizza for $1, guzzle sodas, or fill yourself up on mountains of fabulously tasty but calorie-packed Indian sweets. The statistics are worrying the country's health officials. A study by the Nutrition Foundation of India found that in New Delhi's high-income group, half the women and more than a third of men were overweight. Experts say children are at the greatest risk. Indian kids now spend more time watching cricket on TV than actually playing it. Their eating habits have changed too. Dr. Anup Mishra is head of the Department of Diabetes and Metabolic Disorders at Delhi's Fortis Hospital.
Nowadays, both the parents are working from morning to evening. And children come home, eat whatever they want. They order from fast food joint, which deliver at home. Plus, there is a particular Indian mentality of making a child eat. And if a child is normal weight, they say, well, he is very weak. So that mother will make him eat more till he is chubby and say, well, now child is healthy. They don't know the ills of obesity.
I can't tell you how many times I've been told that fashion isn't for me, or if I want clothes, I should go to the men's section, but I do not want men's clothes.
That's Nisha Sumaya. She's been overweight for years. A few years ago, she got so fed up with being treated like an outcast every time she went shopping, she decided to open a store selling fashionable clothes for large women. It was a good move. She now has a chain of such shops. Yet Nisha says too much attention is now being paid to India's growing waistline. She thinks the real issue is the exact opposite, the pressure that India's changing society now places on women to look like supermodels.
If I think of the actresses in the 50s, 60s, 70s, none of them were skinny. In fact, I might go to the other extreme of saying, I think anorexia is on the rise. Because when I was in college or I was in school, there were never that many thin girls with navels showing, tight clothes. I do not remember seeing so many perfect bodies as a child.
But statistics pouring in from doctors in cities all over the country suggest that the obesity problem is real enough. India already has the world's largest number of diabetics, some 35 million. The World Health Organization says this is likely to more than double in the next 25 years. Dr. Anu Mishra again.
The problem is that this is not being recognized enough. Now there is increasing exposure in the media, but still, if you go to those who decide the health policy, they still say, well, we have other priorities, this is not a priority. But actually, this is taking a whole lot of health budget because a person becomes diabetic, he is diabetic for the whole life, and he will develop heart disease, that's for the whole life.
Doctors fear that unless the issue is tackled immediately, India will see a huge rise in diabetes, hypertension and heart disease cases. In a country where nearly half the toddlers are undernourished, it's hard to see how the already inadequate health system will cope. For NPR News, I'm Mandy Cunningham in New Delhi.
Well, there's several interesting things about that clip. First, it shows some of the human beings who are affected by this. It talks about the potential healthcare costs of this in a country like India. But it covers certain things and other things it doesn't. And they're embedded in this conversation that we have is a trap that America fell into, and it's possible that a country like India will as well. And it's the idea that you can treat these problems away. Now in the United States, the traditional approach, and we'll cover this when I come back and do a lecture for you guys on the issue of public health and public health models. The traditional approach in the United States, when there's some kind of a disease that affects health, is you treat it. And the typical model that we hope works for many diseases would be like an ear infection in a child. There's a disease, it's easily diagnosed, fairly easily treated, you give people the medicine, the patients are happy, the parents are happy, the doctor feels good about it, everybody wins. That's the traditional model. That model just does not apply to chronic diseases, and it doesn't apply to obesity or diet-related problems in general. And so I'll show you some information later in the class about how we have approached this issue in the United States, which is to spend billions of dollars on research to treat obesity, very little money in comparison on preventing the problem. That is a trap. It's like the quicksand is sitting there. Is India going to walk into it? Now, whether this particular radio clip typifies what the thinking in India is you can't make that assumption. And in fact, there are some very progressive people in India who are paying a lot of attention to the prevention of the problem. But at least in this radio clip, it was about clinics, it was about treatment, it was about the people with the problem going to some expert that would deliver help once the problem exists. But there was really very little talk in there about the prevention of the problem, and that's a whole different approach. So we have to hope that countries like India will avoid that trap that America fell into and take a different kind of an approach. I showed you, I believe in the very first class, a slide that is the projected increases in diabetes in different countries, and I'd like to show you a few more to help round out that knowledge. If we look in the next 25 years or so, about that are projections on the number of cases of diabetes. And as I said before, nearly all of these cases are driven by poor diet and physical inactivity, and then the obesity they cause. The numbers are really quite staggering. So we're expecting 13 million new cases of diabetes in the US in the next 25 years. That's a very high number, an alarming number. But in China, the numbers are multiples, twice that, and then it's even more than that in India. And so the number of millions of people to be affected is really quite high. Now, of course, there's a denominator issue here because the populations are so large in India and China compared to the US that you'd expect even a low base rate of the problem to turn into high numbers because of the large populations. But if we look at the percentage increase in diabetes in these countries, you see the picture still remains pretty similar. And as the audio clip suggested, the increase expected in India in particular is very, very alarming. If we collapse data across all the developed and all the developing countries, and I believe I showed you this one before, you see what the picture is like. So certainly the health burden is changing around the world, the diet is changing a lot, and it's happening in ways that are having a big impact on disease. So it's not just an academic matter, it's a very important matter for even the well-being of the healthcare systems in these countries. I'd like now to turn our attention to two other case studies that we were going to discuss today, and talk about South Africa and Finland. And there was a 5-part series that I urge you to listen to on Public Radio International that was co-produced with the BBC on this. And if you go to the website the 2 web addresses that I give you here, it's for parts 1 and 2, and we're going to listen to those right now. But I urge you to listen to all 5 parts because it's a really very good series. So PRI International and the BBC decided to do a series of discussions about the global obesity issue. And it's very interesting about the way they broke this down into different topics. And as you'll see from these particular clips, there's discussion on the impact on individuals of the problem, but then when the attention turns to Finland, there's more discussion about what might be done to prevent the problems and what kind of interventions might occur, not necessarily through medical care, but through public policy that can have a beneficial impact. Okay, so here we go.
Hi, I'm Marco Werman. This is The World, a co-production of the BBC World Service, PRI, and WGBH Boston. Welcome to our special podcast on global obesity. Many epidemiologists believe that the medical problems associated with obesity could be the major health challenge of this century. We're not just talking about people with a few extra pounds. The health effects of being slightly overweight aren't so clear, but we do know that being severely overweight can kill you and is killing more people every year. In decades past, obesity was almost exclusively a problem in the developed world, but today people are actually getting fatter faster in places we're more likely to associate with malnourishment, like Nigeria, India, even Ethiopia. It turns out that a history of malnourishment among the people in these countries may put them at greater risk of dying from the diseases of obesity. In part 1 of our series, the world's Patrick Cox reports from South Africa.
Meet Innocent Shia Nshili,
I'm 38.
38 years old and tipping the scales at 267 pounds. Nshili has high blood pressure and doctors say she's on the verge of becoming diabetic. She lives in a slum on the edge of Cape Town.
I moved here with my husband and my 4 children.
Nshili grew up in a poor farming village a few hundred miles away. She wasn't overweight then. As a child, she says she was relatively small.
I was eating vegetables, taking walk, working, doing exercises. People who were there at that time were not sick.
Things changed when she moved to the city.
I gained weight when I came here, but I didn't know that I gained weight because I'm eating fatty things. I thought I gained weight because I'm growing.
Now I'll stop in a few places and just insert a few editorial comments. What's interesting about this little example in South Africa so far is the impact of moving to an urban area. The other thing is the interesting concept of how could somebody who's living in dire poverty in the slums of a city in South Africa have the money to secure that many calories to gain that much weight, as this particular woman has. As we'll talk about in our class on economics, poverty drives people towards certain types of food. And it used to be the case that poverty drove people towards certain local food selections, which were fine for the most part. It may not have been the best possible food, but still there wasn't going to be overnourishment. But now in many parts of the world, poverty leads people to the foods that provide the cheapest calories, and those tend to be the most energy-dense foods. A very similar picture to what we see in the United States. When you look at the foods that the poor have access to, they tend to be the very calorie-dense foods.
Nshili is among the 30% of South African women who are obese. That compares with 33% in the United States. To give a sense of how doctors define obesity, someone who stands 5 foot 6 inches would be classified as obese if he or she weighed more than 185 pounds. Doctors are worried not just about the sheer number of obese people in South Africa and other developing nations, they're concerned about the deadliness of obesity here. It turns out that obesity may be especially dangerous in adults who were malnourished as children. Here's Andrew Prentice. He's a professor of international nutrition at the University of London.
A baby may be conceived when the mother's in a rural area, may be undernourished as a fetus, born as a small baby, then during its early life or later life move to an urban area and have a rich diet and become obese.
Because of the undernourishment in early childhood, vital organs like the pancreas don't fully develop. So, says Prentice, when food becomes more available later in life, those organs will become less able to do their jobs.
Now that child, we're pretty certain, is likely to suffer a much greater chance of having diseases such as diabetes, because it becomes adapted as a fetus and in utero. It becomes adapted to expecting a frugal supply of energy and nutrients, and its physiology changes its set point so that it expects that. And then when it has more food, then that really signals extra health problems for the future.
Those extra problems are made worse when people's lifestyles change. In South Africa, hundreds of thousands of blacks migrated from rural areas to townships in the early 90s. As apartheid-era restrictions on movement came to an end, rural people still flocked to cities. Similar migrations take place across the developing world, and often the small amount of extra money gained by living in the city does not lead to improved health. It often means adding fat to the family dinner.
Now, one interesting part of that discussion right there is that when people move from the rural areas to the urban areas and start eating a worse diet and start gaining weight, there might be a way of compensating for that, namely increased physical activity to offset the increased calories. But in fact, people tend to become less physically active in those environments, and then you have a double whammy going on, if you will. More calories, a worse partitioning of the diet, that is, more things like fat, sugar, and salt, and less physical activity, so less ability to compensate for the dietary insult that's occurring.
Patricia Saka is another heavy-set mother of 4 who was born in a village and is now living in the city. She's preparing a dinner of tripe. In the village, eating a sheep's stomach would have been a luxury. Saka boils the tripe and then drowns it in lamb fat.
It's very, very, very rich.
Just how her family likes it.
Nice.
Eating a fatty, filling meal here in the city is a way of expressing that you've made it. You're no longer merely surviving on grains and greens.
We are African. We don't eat liberal food, you know. We eating too much. That's the way we are.
The people that we are dealing with now are those who have been in the city less than 5 years, but already they've put on weight.
This is Tandy Kwana. She's a professor of public health in Cape Town. She tracks the dietary habits of recent arrivals.
And what is interesting is that when they visit the rural areas, people praise them that, oh, you are happy in the city, look at, how you are overweight and you look nice. So they are being praised for that. So it's an incentive for them.
Another incentive, if you're heavy, people assume you're healthy. If you suddenly lose weight, some may think you've contracted HIV.
So let's look just at that little discussion about the social norms. So embedded in this case study of people in the urban areas of South Africa, you have migration from the rural to the urban areas playing a role, poverty plays a role, physical inactivity plays a role, access to certain foods plays a role, and in this little discussion that just occurred, social norms play a role too. So this perception that if you're not overweight, it means that you haven't made it, or that you're infected with a stigmatized disease, HIV. All these things are extremely interesting, all play a complicated role in the process.
Something else Tandy Kwana comes across a lot.
In the same home, you find that the mother is overweight and the child is underweight.
So even in the urban areas where Kwana works, the problem of malnourished babies persists. She says both mother and child typically eat a staple of cornmeal porridge. The mother may add fatty meat to hers. She's likely to dilute the child's with water. What neither is likely to eat are many vegetables, plentiful in the countryside, hard to find in a poor urban area. And these dietary patterns aren't unique to South Africa.
That is played out throughout Africa, and I see this very much in my research in the Gambia.
Again, the University of London's Andrew Prentice. His fieldwork in the West African nation of the Gambia has convinced him that the global obesity epidemic is spreading much faster in Africa than in developed countries.
A few years ago, it would have been extremely difficult to find an obese person in the Gambia. Now it's extremely easy to find them, and they're even penetrating into the rural areas.
In nearly every African nation, the incidence of diabetes is rising. Yet across the continent, health services are geared to deal more with contagious diseases than with a so-called lifestyle disease like diabetes.
And so the case fatality rates of diabetes are, a study in Tanzania has shown them to be about 12 or so times as high as someone in the US who gets diabetes. So the treatment is very, very poor.
South Africa is the richest nation in Africa, yet even here, few health workers focus on diabetes prevention among the black population, and those who do say their work is ill-funded by the government. So, in the future, there are likely to be many more stories, like the one Daphne Dumane tells. Dumane didn't know she had diabetes until her legs turned an ominous color.
Black. Doctor said you must cut it.
Doctors amputated both legs a year ago, and they told Dumane to start eating different foods.
Brown bread. Skim milk, fish, chicken, and fruit.
But these items aren't available here in the slum. To find them, she'd have to ride the bus into Cape Town, and even then they'd be pricey.
I'm not telling lies. I can't eat that food because there's no money. I haven't got money.
All Dumane can do to battle her weight and her diabetes, she says, is come here to a church hall where a group of overweight women is exercising. The other women stand. Dumane remains in her wheelchair and she sways her arms in rhythm. The diseases of obesity were not the challenges these women had expected to face. There are so many seemingly greater problems here: AIDS, crime, poverty. But more and more South Africans are dying from diabetes. Only AIDS is rising more rapidly as a cause of death here. And so the women exercise and they pray. The World Health Organization projects that the worldwide incidence of obesity will nearly double in the next 10 years. That means another 300 million people at heightened risk for diabetes, heart disease, stroke, cancer, and most of them will live in the developing world, the very countries least equipped for the health challenges ahead. For The World, I'm Patrick Cox.
Go to any book.
Now, before we move on to the next segment, which deals with a different country altogether, let's just conclude a little bit about South Africa. You get a very clear picture in this scene about how dire the problem is of obesity and poor diet. But wasn't it interesting to hear about this special risk posed by undernourishment to later development, and how the undernourishment at one point of life may create elevated risk at another? Now we can hope that the World Health Authorities and other countries and South Africa itself will pay attention to this impending crisis and take novel, creative, and bold action to deal with it. But again, there are traps that countries could fall into, there are opportunities, and it'll be very interesting to see how this takes place. Now let's hear about how a different country has dealt with this issue, in this case Finland. And one of the people interviewed in this particular clip is a well-known scientist from Finland named Pekka Puska, P-U-S-K-A. He was an incredibly innovative scientist at a time when very few people were caring about community interventions for things like heart disease, and he pushed and pushed against great odds to make some changes in Finland. After he did this, he spent some time in Geneva at the World Health Organization, and then more recently has returned to Finland, and he's Minister of Health for the country. But a very interesting player in this whole picture, and he's helped change to some extent the way the world looks at intervening with these problems.
And you'll find volume after volume devoted to dieting. For people who want to lose weight, there's no shortage of advice, and yet in America and around the world, people are not losing weight. In fact, some health experts say we're in the midst of a global obesity epidemic. The problem is that even when individuals know they should change how they eat, they rarely do. One nation, however, has shown that people's eating habits can be radically improved. The trick? Changing what kind of food the public is exposed to. The world's Patrick Cox reports from Finland.
In the small Finnish town of Tomajärvi, 10 miles from the Russian border, teacher Jukka Holtinen dismisses his 4th grade class. Holtinen grew up in this remote province of Finland. It's called North Karelia. His childhood was marred by the death of his father.
My father died when he was 38 years old. I was 10 years old.
Holtinen's father collapsed one night on the dance floor, the victim of a heart attack.
It was his 3rd heart attack.
There was nothing out of the ordinary about this in North Karelia in the 1970s. At the time, Finland had the world's highest death rate from heart disease. North Karelia's rate was 40% higher than that.
The heart disease was so common. Young men, husbands, fathers died. There was so much suffering in the community.
This is Pekka Puska, who was then a young public health physician based in Helsinki. Puska, who now runs Finland's National Public Health Institute, was dispatched to North Karelia to lead an ambitious campaign to change the population's eating habits.
So when we came there for prevention, people were very, very interested.
Pekka Puska came to our house, I think it was 1978.
That was 2 years after Jukka Holtinen's father died. What Puska found in the Holtinen kitchen was fairly typical. The family relied on fatty meat, salt, cheese and butter, washed down with pint after pint of whole milk. Some North Karelians had almost never eaten vegetables before Puska's team told them to.
When they say that we had to drink skim milk, it was horrible.
But you got used to it?
Yes, of course. Nowadays I drink only skim milk.
North Karelia's problems with heart disease could be traced not just to the food the locals were eating, but to the food they were producing, low-grade pork and dairy products.
People were used to that. That was local production, and of course there was a strong dairy industry, so there were a lot of economic vested interests.
Puska realized that merely urging people to eat healthier foods wasn't enough. He needed to make those foods more available and more affordable.
So that's one key about this project in North Karelia that Puska ran, that not only are they focusing on the individual and education and the sort of typical change people would think about, but he's talking about intervening in the environment and making changes. And this is one of the ways that Puska's program differed from similar programs in the United States that were not having very impressive results at the time he was. So we'll play this out and you'll hear more about that.
And that meant taking on the pig and dairy farmers, people who viewed him as a health nut from the big city who was trying to run them out of business.
It was so harsh, so intense, the opposition, that period was commonly called as fat war.
To win the fat war, Puska took on government policies. At the time, agricultural subsidies encouraged the production of the very foods that were helping to cause so many heart attacks. Dairy subsidies, for example, were based on fat content. Puska and his colleagues convinced the government to radically change direction. The government began funding research into low-grade cheeses and non-dairy spreads that found their way onto supermarket shelves. It phased out milk subsidies, and it introduced subsidies for some new products.
Quite many of the milk producers, they changed to berries.
North Karelian farmer Ismo Rutiainen began growing strawberries and boysenberries. He says he made a handsome profit.
It was really good business.
Soon, more than 24 berry farms were operating in North Karelia. A new micro-industry was born. Meanwhile, Puska and his team were encouraging the public to eat more berries and other fruits and vegetables. They worked with housewives groups, and they laced their message with positive incentives, like cash prizes for the winners of town versus town cholesterol-lowering showdowns. The North Karelian experiment proved a success. From 1970 to 1995, cholesterol and blood pressure levels dropped. More importantly, deaths from heart disease also dropped by 73% for the group most at risk, middle-aged men.
73% drop in heart attacks for that highly vulnerable group. That's a really staggering finding.
The government replicated the North Karelian model across Finland with similar results. This record of success was particularly striking because large-scale attempts to reduce heart disease in other countries, including the US, have achieved far less impressive results. Kelly Brownell, director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity at Yale, says that's because most programs aimed at changing eating habits rely almost exclusively on public education.
Education alone is notoriously inadequate. So you have to do what the Finns did, which is to change the environment that's causing the problem in concert with some education.
In other words, he says, you can't just tell people to eat healthy foods. You have to make it easy for them to choose those foods. Today, Finland's environment-oriented approach to nutrition is focused on its schools. At this elementary school in North Karelia, children serve themselves buffet style to salmon, potatoes, beets and salad with dark rye bread on the side. To drink, there's skim milk, 2% or fat-free sour milk. There are no vending machines selling sugary soda. Contrast that to the US, where some school districts have signed long-term contracts with soft drink companies that guarantee the presence of vending machines. Government influence over the food environment extends to students' homes. At medical exams, school nurses ask students about their eating habits and lifestyle. Nurse Lena Weisto doesn't shy away from following up if she thinks there are problems at home. Would you contact the parents?
Sometimes, yes.
What do you say to them?
I'm talking about their customs and how they are making food and teaching.
Do you say to the parents, you're feeding your child too much fat or too much salt?
Yes, I do. That's my job.
What Weisto considers to be her job might in the US more likely be called an invasion of privacy, the work of an overzealous nanny state. But Weisto says it's effective, and that's all she cares about. Yet Finland's success at improving diet and health appears to have stalled. The number of overweight children has begun to rise here, just like everywhere else in the world. And in North Karelia, obesity is now the #1 child health concern. Again, Yale's Kelly Brownell.
The Finnish program was the most imaginative program in the world dealing with human nutrition, and it had very good effects. But the world has changed.
For Finland, the world changed in 1995. That's when the country joined the European Union, and also when the World Trade Organization came into being. Supermarkets that had been stocked with mainly Finnish products now offered a broad range of imported foods, many of them less nutritious. And fast food chains established themselves across the country. Brownell says Finland has lost control of its food environment.
International trade policies, agriculture subsidy policies, the way marketing is done these days is completely global. And so one country simply can't control so much of what comes across its borders, which argues for a global solution.
Brownell says that solution should use Finland as a model. He proposes an international treaty that would declare nutrition a cornerstone of all nations' economic policies. Countries would eliminate food subsidies or redirect them to promote healthy foods. They would use tax incentives to encourage manufacturers to make more nutritious products. Global trade agreements would uphold these priorities. This may seem an unrealistic vision, but Brownell says just you wait. If obesity continues its rapid spread, the world may soon be ready for a bold solution, like tiny North Karelia was a generation ago, when so many of its men were dying in their prime.
So, just you wait. We will see what happens, and then later in the class we'll talk about what some of these global solutions will be. But you see in a country like North Karelia, or Finland, in that North Karelia area in particular, how vexing a problem this is, because even they, with the amount of effort that they put in, are having trouble controlling the problem. Two things I'd like to draw your attention to, and then we'll end with today's comedy clip. One sign of the change of the diet around the world is what's happening in the Mediterranean part of the world and the erosion of that diet, which, as we explained before, has considerable health benefits. A number of you, by the way, when you guys see things in the press or interesting photos or things that you think might be helpful for the class, please send them to me. And a number of you noted an article that was in the New York Times last week that talked about the erosion of the diet. And in this case, the story in the Times, which was really quite good, talked about a particular island in Greece called Castelli and what had happened in that island. And they talked about how the traditional food culture that had the components of the Mediterranean diet that we talked about earlier has been eroded, and now there's much more imported food, but also Greek versions of the fast food. So in this case, you can see pizza, hamburgers, and other things on the menu of this place on that particular island. That was an interesting anecdotal story. The New York Times sent somebody, they went there, they talked to people, and they saw what was happening on the ground in that area. But there's also research on this. There was a report published in July of this year by the Food and Agriculture Organization, which, as I mentioned before, it's in Rome, but it's part of the United Nations. This compared looked at 15 European Union countries, but it took the Mediterranean countries that were in this sample, Spain, Greece, and Italy, and compared it to the others. And if you'd like to see the whole report, the website is listed there. They looked at how things were changing in those particular countries. So if you look at all the EU countries combined on the left and the Mediterranean countries on the right, and then you see what happened between 1963 and 2003 with sodium intake, with salt intake, here's the picture that you get. In 1963, the Mediterranean countries were looking better than the rest of the EU as a group in terms of sodium intake. But in 2003, you can see what's happened in both sets of countries. The sodium intake has gone way the heck up. That's a really remarkable increase. Number is much higher than health authorities would recommend. And the advantage of the Mediterranean diet or the people living in those countries is still apparent, but not nearly what it was before. And so there are real problems there. That represents a 50% increase, 64% increase over here. So the Mediterranean part of the EU is starting to catch up to the others. And if you look at the number of calories per day per person in these countries, you get interesting phenomenon. And let's look at these three countries, Italy, Greece, and Spain, to see what happened over that period of time. So here's Spain, the number of calories per day per person. Now again, that's happening at the same time physical activity is declining. So we can't be surprised by problems with disease. The numbers for Italy look like this. And then the numbers for Greece look like this. When you put all this together, I'm going to skip this, but you'll see it in the slides. There are a number of hypothesized reasons for it, things that we talked about some today, but we'll talk about later in the class as well. And there are now many studies on this particular topic. So this one in particular talks about North India, and it talks about how men in the rural areas of North India have 5 times the physical activity, more obesity in the urban areas, as the clip on South Africa suggested. Here's another example of a study that was done in the Amazon area of Peru, and they found in this case that the more people adhered to a traditional diet, the healthier their diet was. And then this was a paper that was in your readings that talked about the New World Order and how colonization is having an impact. And there's a quote that I don't need to repeat because it was in the paper. But it shows pretty clearly what's happening worldwide. So I hope what we've painted today is a picture that shows that there's great reason to be concerned about what's happening worldwide, opportunities and challenges, but certainly places where we can intervene.